The night was blacker than oil. June 7th, 1944, off the western coast of the Philippines. The sea was calm, but beneath its stillness lurked a hunter. 200 feet below the surface, in the narrow metal belly of the USS Harder, SS-257, every man held his breath. The faint hum of electric motors filled the control room. Red lights bathed the faces of 30 men, silent, waiting, watching. At the periscope, Commander Samuel D. Dealey leaned forward. Through the glass, he saw faint silhouettes, Japanese destroyers, cutting across the horizon in rigid formation, escorting their convoy northward. They believed no American submarine would dare come this close to land, this close to danger. Dealey whispered a single word to his crew. Fire. A hiss of compressed air. Then, moments later, a thunderclap beneath the sea. One destroyer erupted into flame, its hull cracking open like thunder splitting the sky. Above the surface, Japanese officers screamed in disbelief. Below, Dealey's men reloaded in silence. The hunt had just begun. The Pacific War was turning, and Japan was about to learn the price of underestimating a single submarine. By the summer of 1944, the tides of the Pacific War had turned against Japan. What began in 1941 as a swift conquest across Southeast Asia had become a desperate struggle for survival. The once mighty Imperial Navy, victorious at Pearl Harbor, Singapore, and the Philippines, was now bleeding in every ocean. The Allies had seized the initiative. American carrier task forces roamed the Central Pacific, island by island, pushing toward the Japanese homeland. Air superiority was no longer contested, but beneath the surface, a quieter, more relentless war was being fought, a war Japan was dangerously unprepared to face. For Japan, the lifeline of empire ran through the sea. From Borneo, the oil fields. From Malaya, the rubber and tin. From the home islands, troops and weapons for the defense of distant outposts. Every drop of fuel, every ton of steel, every grain of rice had to move across vast waters. Without its merchant convoys, Japan's war machine would starve, and that lifeline had begun to unravel. American submarines, once dismissed as an afterthought, had become Japan's most lethal enemy. By 1944, fewer than 2% of the U.S. Navy's personnel served in submarines, yet they were responsible for over half of Japan's maritime losses. The ocean had become a graveyard for convoys. But it hadn't been that way from the start. In 1942 and early 1943, U.S. submarines were plagued by faulty torpedoes, hesitant commanders, and confused doctrine. Torpedoes detonated too early, too late, or not at all. Submarines attacked timidly, firing from too far away, diving too soon. Japan's supply routes, though stretched thin, continued to operate. Then came a new breed of commander, bold, aggressive, and unafraid to bring the fight directly to the enemy. Men like Dudley Mush Morton of Wahoo, Richard O'Kane of Tang, and Samuel D. Dealey of Harder. They transformed submarine warfare from cautious observation to predatory assault. Dealey's background was as calm as his future actions were ferocious. Born in Dallas, Texas, and a graduate of the Naval Academy, he was quiet, thoughtful, and deeply religious. But beneath his modest manner burned a fierce resolve. His men called him Sam Dealey, never sir. He led not with blood. By 1944, Dealey and his Harder had already earned a formidable reputation. 5 patrols behind them, dozens of ships sunk, a growing legend among submarine crews. His name carried weight not just in American bases, but in the whispered fear of Japanese convoys. Japan, however, did not fully understand what it faced. The Imperial Navy's convoy system remained rigid and outdated. Escort destroyers were few, their sonar technology primitive. Communications were fragmented. Radar sets were scarce. Convoy commanders often relied more on instinct than data, and their confidence in Japan's superiority, once justified, had turned into dangerous arrogance. The Philippines and the South China Sea had become a bottleneck. Dozens of convoys passed through those waters each month, bringing oil from Borneo and troops to reinforce island garrisons. Each convoy's safety depended on discipline, coordination, and speed. Yet by mid-1944, those qualities were failing. When the Harder left Fremantle, Australia, for her 5th patrol in May 1944, her mission was simple but perilous. Penetrate the heavily guarded waters around Tawi-Tawi, a forward Japanese fleet anchorage in the Sulu archipelago, and attack enemy warships supporting the defense of the Philippines. It was a suicide mission by any measure. Dealey knew it, his crew knew it, but their orders were clear. Strike deep, strike hard, and disrupt Japan's defenses before the U.S. invasion fleet arrives. Ahead of them lay some of the most dangerous waters in the Pacific: narrow straits, shallow channels, and constant air patrols. The Japanese believed no submarine could survive there. They were wrong. Dealey's first sighting of the enemy would come sooner than anyone expected, and his actions in the days that followed would defy every rule of submarine warfare. The Harder was about to become a legend beneath the waves. The Japanese Empire had built its military power on the foundation of maritime supply. Every destroyer, carrier, and bomber in its far-flung empire depended on convoys steaming from the resource fields of Southeast Asia to the home islands. But by 1944, that supply network was collapsing under invisible assault. Between Formosa and Borneo, across the narrow lanes of the Sulu and Celebes seas, Japanese transports formed long, vulnerable columns. Each carried vital cargo: crude oil, aviation fuel, ammunition, or troops bound for the Philippines. Escorts, often a handful of overworked destroyers, tried to guard them, but the numbers no longer matched the need. Radar and sonar were crude copies of British sets, plagued by maintenance issues. Training for anti-submarine warfare was minimal. The Imperial Navy had never expected to fight for control of its own shipping lanes. Admiral Miniechi Koga's combined fleet was trapped in a cruel paradox. To defend Japan's empire, it needed fuel. But to get fuel, its ships had to traverse seas now dominated by American submarines. By early 1944, Japanese tankers were being sunk faster than they could be replaced. Some bases were rationing oil to a few gallons per aircraft sortie. Even destroyers were ordered to cut back on training cruises to conserve fuel. And still, Tokyo's naval staff clung to confidence. Convoy commanders reported that American submarines do not operate near our fleet anchorages. That assumption would soon prove fatal. In May 1944, the Imperial Navy assembled a large force at Tawi-Tawi, an island group near Borneo. The anchorage bustled with battleships, cruisers, and carriers preparing for the defense of the Marianas. It was, effectively, the beating heart of Japan's naval operations, protected, they believed, by geography and distance. Into this cauldron sailed the USS Harder. Commander Samuel Dealey had been briefed personally by Vice Admiral Ralph Christie at Fremantle. He was to patrol near Tawi-Tawi, report fleet movements, and attack any targets of opportunity. The risk was extreme. The area was shallow, with strong currents and daily air patrols. Submarines had rarely returned from such missions. The Harder was a Gato-class submarine, 311 feet of steel, equipped with 10 torpedo tubes, 4 aft and 6 forward. On the surface, she could reach 20 knots, submerged, barely 9. Her endurance came from stealth, not speed. Every crewman understood that once discovered, survival depended on nerve, silence, and luck. Dealey's crew had become a finely tuned machine. They had spent months together in the confined heat of the boat, sleeping beside torpedoes, breathing recycled air, and enduring constant drills. Each man trusted the other completely. When Dealey gave an order, it was obeyed instantly, without question. They entered the Sulu Sea in late May, slipping past patrol craft under the cover of darkness. The hydrophones crackled with propeller noise. Convoys everywhere. The Japanese were moving troops from Singapore to reinforce Biak and Halmahera. Destroyers prowled the channels, their searchlights sweeping the water. What the Japanese didn't know was that their security system worked against them. Convoy schedules were predictable. Escorts used repetitive patterns, and communications were poorly encrypted. U.S. intelligence, via code-breaking and reconnaissance, fed Dealey precise data. The Harder wasn't hunting blindly. She knew roughly where and when her prey would appear. On June 6, Dealey's radar picked up the first contact, a small convoy escorted by the destroyer Minazuki. The next day, the Harder fired 4 torpedoes and sent Minazuki to the bottom. The explosion was so violent it was detected by distant Japanese bases, but local commanders dismissed the reports. They insisted it must have been an accident or a mine. That disbelief set the tone for what followed. Each time the Harder struck, the Japanese command refused to accept that a single submarine was operating inside their supposedly secure waters. They doubled down on denial, ordering more ships into the same danger zone. Dealey understood their psychology. 1. The human angle. Life beneath the waves. Inside a World War II submarine, time lost its shape. Days blurred into endless cycles of heat, sweat, and tension. For the crew of the USS Harder, every dive was a brush with death. The air was thick with diesel and oil, the temperature often above 100 degrees. Metal walls sweated condensation. The smell of unwashed clothes, machinery grease, and battery acid filled every compartment. Sleep came in fragments, 4 hours at a time, in narrow bunks stacked 3 high. When a torpedo was loaded, the men slept beside it, knowing it was both their weapon and potential coffin. The constant hum of engines and the faint hiss of compressed air were the soundtrack of their world. But beneath the discomfort was a sense of brotherhood. Every man aboard Harder understood his role in something far larger than himself. The sonar operator, headphones pressed tight, listening for distant propellers. The helmsman, steering by instinct and voice commands. The cook, preparing meals on a swaying stove. And at the center of it all was Commander Samuel Dealey, calm, deliberate, and unshakably confident. His leadership style was quiet but absolute. He never raised his voice. His presence steadied even the most frightened sailor. In moments of crisis, he'd stand in the control room, one hand on the periscope handles, his tone so composed that panic simply couldn't take root. His men later said, "When Dealey looked through that scope, you knew something was about to die." Life aboard Harder was measured in whispers and seconds. A single sonar ping could mean discovery. A single wrong maneuver could mean a slow, crushing death at the bottom of the sea. Yet, to those 70 men, the submarine was more than steel. It was home, a floating heartbeat in the middle of enemy waters. 2. The technological angle. Tools of the silent service. The Harder represented the cutting edge of 1944 submarine warfare. The Gatto-class design was rugged, adaptable, and lethal. It could dive to 300 feet, carry 24 torpedoes, and remain at sea for 2 months without resupply. But the true power lay in the technology that allowed it to stalk prey unseen. American submarines had learned from bitter experience. Early in the war, their Mark 14 torpedoes had been disastrously unreliable, running too deep, failing to detonate, or circling back on the firing sub. But by 1944, those flaws had been largely corrected. The Mark 18 electric torpedo, though slower, left no telltale bubble trail, and Dealey's crew had mastered both types. The Harder's radar could detect ships at night long before they were visible on the horizon. Its sonar, the ears of the boat, could read the distance and bearing of enemy destroyers, even through layers of thermal current. In Dealey's hands, these instruments became extensions of instinct. He trusted his senses, but he also trusted the new science of underwater warfare. The Japanese, meanwhile, lagged far behind. Their sonar, copied from early British models, was crude and unreliable. Their radar was scarce and often misused. Many escort destroyers lacked the discipline to operate in coordinated search patterns. Some commanders still preferred visual lookouts over electronic instruments, believing that samurai eyes were sharper than machines. It was a fatal misjudgment. When Harder prowled near Tawi-Tawi, she was often within a few miles of Japanese destroyers, but they never knew. Dealey used the thermal layers of the sea, hiding his submarine below temperature gradients that distorted sonar returns. He could hear them, they could not hear him. Every engagement was a test of nerves and physics. When the submarine fired, the torpedoes swam out silently, guided only by preset gyroscopes. Seconds stretched into eternity as the crew counted under their breath. 1001, 1002, until the sea erupted. Technology gave Harder her edge, but it was Dealey's mastery of timing and sound that turned machinery into art. 3. The command angle, arrogance and miscalculation. On the other side of the ocean, Japan's naval command operated within a fog of overconfidence. For years, their officers had been trained to think of submarines as inferior weapons, useful for scouting, but unworthy of decisive battle. The Imperial Navy's doctrine revolved around surface fleets and carrier power. Submarines were seen as tools for opportunistic ambushes, not sustained campaigns. That philosophy carried over to their defense against U.S. submarines. Japanese admirals saw convoy protection as a secondary task, tedious, defensive, and beneath the prestige of combat command. Escort captains were often assigned based on seniority, not skill. Coordination between air patrols, destroyers, and shore stations was almost non-existent. Even as merchant losses mounted, Japanese reports continued to downplay submarine attacks. When ships vanished, commanders blamed mechanical failure or enemy mines. The notion that a single U.S. submarine could penetrate guarded waters and destroy warships was dismissed as propaganda. This mindset proved disastrous when the Harder began its fifth patrol. Each of Dealey's attacks violated every Japanese assumption. He operated inside their fleet anchorage, surfaced in daylight, and sank destroyers that were supposed to be hunters, not prey. Yet Tokyo's naval staff refused to believe the reports from the field. Messages sent from surviving escort captains were often intercepted by U.S. intelligence. They described confusion, disbelief, and panic. Enemy submarine operates as though invulnerable, fires at close range, impossible behavior. To the Americans, it was proof that the balance of initiative had shifted. To the Japanese, it was inconceivable. A single submarine defying an entire fleet. But the disbelief would not last long. The next days would bring a sequence of attacks so audacious that even the most skeptical admirals in Tokyo could no longer deny what had happened. 4. The tactical angle, hunting beneath the waves. The art of submarine warfare in 1944 was a blend of science, intuition, and sheer nerve. Commander Dealey approached each engagement like a chess master, calculating moves several steps ahead while feeling the rhythm of the ocean. Unlike traditional naval battles fought on the surface, undersea combat required patience measured in minutes, or hours. When Harder detected a convoy, Dealey first studied its formation. Japanese destroyers moved in predictable arcs around the transports, sweeping for threats but rarely overlapping sonar coverage. Dealey exploited this pattern. He would position the submarine ahead of the convoy's path, submerged just beneath the thermal layers that distorted sonar detection. From this vantage, the Harder became invisible, both to the naked eye and to the imperfect instruments of her pursuers. Attacking required split-second timing. Torpedo tubes were loaded silently. The captain calculated speed, distance, and angle on the fly. One misjudgment could send torpedoes harmlessly past or trigger a deadly counterattack. Yet Dealey had refined a daring tactic. He often fired at extreme close range, sometimes under 1,000 yards, where the margin for error vanished, but the probability of a kill was near certain. Each salvo was followed by evasive maneuvers. The submarine would dive deep, running silent as Japanese depth charges exploded above, shaking the hull and filling the air with the stench of heated metal. It was a deadly rhythm. Strike, vanish, reassess, strike again. 5. The enemy angle, Japanese confusion and disbelief. From the Japanese perspective, the events unfolding were unprecedented. Their convoys had been drilled for years, taught to repel submarine threats with coordinated escort tactics. Yet none of their theories accounted for Dealey's aggression. Reports from surviving captains tell of vessels moving in tight formations, searching for threats they could not see. Depth charges shook the sea for hours, but the elusive submarine never surfaced. Meanwhile, merchant ships, laden with fuel and ammunition, sailed unaware that one torpedo could annihilate them. The psychological toll was immense. Destroyer commanders began questioning their own instruments, their crews, even the accuracy of intelligence from Tokyo. Impossible, many officers muttered. No single submarine could do this. This disbelief delayed effective countermeasures. 6. The moral angle, the price of hubris. War is rarely fair. It is calculated, yet human error and pride often tip the scales. In this campaign, The Japanese belief in invulnerability became a moral liability. Overconfidence blinded them to the limitations of their ships, their technology, and their training. For the Americans aboard Harder, courage was not just bravery, it was moral precision. Every torpedo fired, every dive executed under fire, required judgment tempered by respect for human life. Dealey did not attack recklessly. He attacked with purpose, targeting military vessels rather than indiscriminately striking cargo ships, though the rules of war allowed it. The moral calculus also extended to psychological warfare. By demonstrating that a single submarine could dominate an entire convoy, Dealey undermined the enemy's confidence without firing extra rounds. Fear became as effective a weapon as steel. Yet the price was high. Each attack risked detection and death. Every crew member knew that a single error could mean the loss of the boat and all souls aboard. In this sense, the courage displayed was both tactical and moral, a testament to discipline and humanity in the midst of annihilation. Connecting forward. Through these angles, the human endurance within Harder, the technological edge of U.S. submarines, the hubris of Japanese command, the precision of tactical execution, and the psychological devastation inflicted on the enemy. The stage was set for the story's climax. The next moments would crystallize everything: a single patrol, one submarine, facing a fortified convoy, yet turning the entire balance of power beneath the waves. The attacks that followed would become legendary, leaving the Japanese commanders in disbelief and immortalizing Samuel Dealey's name in naval history. The sea had quieted, but the shock waves of the Harder's attack rippled far beyond the Sulu Sea. By June 8, 1944, the Japanese survivors struggled to regroup. Destroyer crews counted losses, patched damage, and tried to account for the transports that had escaped or been sunk. Panic and disbelief pervaded the ranks. Officers sent frantic messages to Tawi and higher command, describing a single submarine operating with impossible audacity inside waters considered secure. At the local command post, the reports were received with a mix of skepticism and dread. No single submarine could accomplish such destruction, one admiral wrote. It must have been a coordinated attack by multiple subs. Official communiques instructed commanders to maintain morale and deny rumors, but the evidence spoke for itself. 5 destroyers and 1 transport had been lost, hundreds of sailors killed or in the water, and operational plans thrown into disarray. Survivors clung to life in lifeboats or debris. Many had witnessed the horror of torpedoes detonating at point-blank range, their comrades swallowed by flames and water. Those who survived the initial blasts faced exhaustion, exposure, and the threat of shark-infested waters. For some, the panic of seeing vessels disintegrate into fire and smoke was the only memory they would carry back to Japan. Across the Pacific, American naval intelligence was abuzz. Intercepted Japanese radio traffic confirmed the scale of the attack, validating prior predictions about the vulnerabilities of convoys near Tawi. The Harder's patrol had not only destroyed enemy ships, but had also demonstrated a critical weakness in Japan's maritime logistics. Arrogance and outdated tactics were no match for a skilled and daring submarine commander. Meanwhile, aboard the Harder, Commander Dealey maintained his customary discipline. There was no celebration, only meticulous accounting of torpedoes expended, torpedo tube integrity, and hull condition. Every crew member had done their duty, and every action had been precise. The mission was far from over, but the first stage, the annihilation of the convoy's protective screen, was complete. Japanese survivors' accounts painted a grim picture of confusion and fear. Some reported that officers refused to acknowledge the effectiveness of the attack, claiming that mines or coastal batteries must have been responsible. Others described a complete breakdown in coordination. Depth charges were dropped indiscriminately, search patterns overlapped, and critical communications failed. The entire operation of the convoy system had been shaken, and morale was shattered. News of the incident slowly reached higher command in Tokyo. Even there, disbelief was rampant. Senior officers, conditioned to expect battleships and aircraft to dominate engagements, could not reconcile reports of a lone submarine operating with such lethal efficiency. For Japanese naval strategy, this single engagement forced a bitter acknowledgement. Their convoys were no longer secure. An underestimation of the American submarine threat had deadly consequences. The immediate tactical outcome was clear. Japan had lost vital warships in a critical theater, and the remaining escort forces were demoralized and depleted. Beyond the physical destruction, the psychological impact on Japanese naval personnel would be profound, eroding confidence in their training, technology, and doctrine. The message was unmistakable. The Pacific waters were no longer safe, and the hunter had become the hunted. Yet, for the crew of the Harder, the danger was not over. The Sulu Sea remained patrolled by Japanese destroyers, aircraft scoured the skies, and shallow waters increased the risk of detection. Every man knew that survival demanded continued vigilance. Their achievement had altered the battlefield, but the ocean still demanded respect and caution. The stage was now set for broader consequences, strategic, operational, and psychological, that would reverberate through the Imperial Navy. The next section will explore these far-reaching effects and the lessons learned from the audacity of a single submarine against a nation's lifeline. The destruction wrought by the USS Harder extended far beyond the immediate loss of ships and men. Japan's logistical network, already strained, now faced a critical blow. Convoys, once considered the lifeblood of the empire, could no longer travel the Sulu Sea without fear. Fuel shortages, delays in troop movements, and disrupted supply lines compounded the strategic dilemma facing the Imperial Navy. Tokyo's naval command struggled to respond. New directives were issued, demanding tighter convoy formations and increased escort strength, yet resources were scarce. Destroyers had been lost faster than they could be replaced. Training for anti-submarine warfare remained inadequate, and the Japanese underestimated the cunning of American submarine tactics. The psychological shock of the Harder's audacity paralyzed decision-making. Many officers still refused to accept that one submarine could achieve such devastation. Across the Pacific, Allied commanders took note. The patrol demonstrated the effectiveness of aggressive, single submarine operations against heavily defended convoys. Lessons from Dealey's approach, calculated risk, mastery of thermal layers, precise timing, and relentless pursuit became standard doctrine for the U.S. submarine service. The concept that one skilled submarine could decimate an entire escort screen reshaped operational planning in subsequent campaigns. The human cost was staggering. Hundreds of Japanese sailors perished in the sinking of destroyers and transports. Survivors reported harrowing accounts. Men clinging to floating debris, trapped below decks, or leaping into shark-infested waters to escape burning ships. These personal tragedies underscored the stark reality of submarine warfare. Technology amplified skill, but survival depended on discipline, courage, and, at times, sheer luck. The Harder's patrol also revealed the limitations of Japanese communication and coordination. Reports from the surviving escorts were fragmented and contradictory. Confusion over which ships had survived delayed rescue operations and compounded the sense of chaos. Japanese high command, forced to confront the evidence, could no longer ignore the vulnerability of their maritime supply lines. The notion of safe convoy corridors had been shattered. Strategically, the engagement accelerated the decline of Japan's naval operational flexibility. With fewer destroyers and diminished morale among crews, convoys became increasingly vulnerable to subsequent submarine attacks. The psychological effect on Japan. For Commander Dealey and the crew of the Harder, the aftermath was measured in vigilance rather than celebration. They had survived one of the most dangerous patrols in the Pacific, executed a series of devastating attacks, and escaped virtually unscathed. Their accomplishment became a benchmark for naval excellence, an example of how preparation, courage, and calculated risk could overcome overwhelming odds. By mid-1944, the legend of the Harder had taken root. Japanese officers would continue to debate how a single submarine could strike so decisively, and the Imperial Navy's convoy doctrine would be forced to adapt, albeit too late to prevent further disasters. The patrol exemplified the combination of human skill, technological advantage, and tactical audacity that defined the U.S. submarine campaign, leaving a lasting mark on the Pacific War. The destruction of the convoy at Tawi-Tawi was more than a tactical victory. It was a strategic turning point. The Japanese command's disbelief had amplified the impact, turning a single submarine's operation into a demonstration of vulnerability, hubris, and the shifting balance of power beneath the waves. June 7, 1944. Dawn had barely touched the horizon when the USS Harder glided silently beneath the waves near the Sulu Sea. The air above the surface shimmered in heat, giving the illusion of calm, but below, every man aboard was alert, listening for the faintest sound, a propeller blade, a hull creaking, a sonar ping. Through the periscope, Commander Samuel Dealey observed the Japanese convoy steaming north. 5 destroyers flanked 4 transport ships, their formations tight but predictable. The convoy commander, confident in his escorts, allowed the transports to follow a straight course, unaware that a lethal predator was already positioning itself. Dealey's calculations were precise. He ordered the Harder to surface briefly, using radar to plot the exact speed and heading of each target. Then, the submarine slipped beneath the thermocline, invisible to sonar. The first salvo would decide the engagement. At 0917, the torpedo tubes were opened. Dealey gave the quiet command: fire. 4 torpedoes raced through the water. Moments later, the lead destroyer, Minazuki, erupted. Flames shot into the sky. The hull split, water surged, and alarms rang across the convoy. Japanese officers scrambled to respond, but confusion reigned. The explosion was so unexpected that some initially believed it was a mine detonation. The Harder did not linger. Dive alarms screamed through the submarine as Dealey ordered a rapid descent to evade retaliatory depth charges. The escort destroyers dropped charges methodically, shaking the hull with concussive blasts. Inside, the crew braced for every impact, knowing a single breach could flood compartments and end the patrol. Yet Dealey remained composed. Every sonar echo, every vibration, was analyzed and used to predict the enemy's maneuvers. 30 minutes later, the submarine rose silently to periscope depth. Another destroyer had moved into the line of fire. 4 torpedoes fired again. The result was devastating. The second destroyer, Fuyutsuki, was struck amidships. Black smoke roiled the water. Sailors leapt into the sea. Above, Japanese radio chatter grew frantic. Reports were sent to WWII describing an enemy submarine operating with audacious precision inside our protective screen. But headquarters refused to believe a single submarine could achieve such results. By midday, the Harder had claimed 3 destroyers. The convoy, meanwhile, had lost cohesion. Transports attempted evasive maneuvers, but the loss of escorts left them vulnerable. Some officers ordered zigzag patterns, others tried to speed away, but Dealey anticipated each move. He remained beneath the surface, adjusting for current and thermal layers, waiting for the perfect moment to strike again. By late afternoon, the Harder's attack had created chaos. Fires burned across the water. Destroyers that survived were damaged, confused, and scattered. Japanese gunners, trained to counter threats, could not identify the source of the attacks. Every failed depth charge reinforced their disbelief that a lone submarine could execute such precision. Dealey paused to assess. His men were exhausted, but disciplined. The submarine had already expended several torpedoes, yet the convoy still had targets. The captain knew that patience, not aggression, would secure victory. Each attack had to be perfectly timed. A miscalculation could alert additional reinforcements from WWII. And then, just before sunset, Dealey made the decision that would define the patrol. The Harder maneuvered into the convoy's predicted path, positioning for a strike on the remaining 2 destroyers. With nerves taut, the crew watched the periscope. Angles were verified, distance calculated to the yard. "Fire!" Dealey commanded again. The torpedoes raced through the water, silent hunters beneath the fading light. Seconds later, 2 simultaneous detonations shook the convoy. Smoke, fire, and twisted metal signaled the destruction of the final 2 destroyers. In less than 12 hours, the Harder had annihilated the convoy's protective screen. Above, Japanese commanders refused to believe the reports. "It is impossible," one officer wrote. "No single submarine could strike with such accuracy inside WWII's security perimeter." Yet the evidence was undeniable. 5 destroyers were lost, transports scattered, and morale shattered. Beneath the waves, Dealey ordered the Harder to withdraw silently. No celebration was voiced, no cheers disturbed the tense air. Survival remained paramount. The ocean had taken its toll, but the battle was not yet over. The destruction had been total, yet the most critical moments, the pursuit, the counterattacks, and the desperate evasions, were still to come. The Harder had proven what one submarine could do, but it was only the beginning of a legendary engagement that would leave Japan's naval command. The afternoon sky darkened as the USS Harder lingered beneath the waves. The Sulu Sea had become a graveyard of fire and wreckage, but Commander Dealey knew the danger was far from over. The Japanese had begun to organize a counterattack. Destroyers, not yet sunk, moved aggressively, depth charges plummeting into the water, shaking the hull of the Harder with every explosion. Inside the submarine, the crew worked in tense synchrony. Sonar operators called out echoes. The helmsman adjusted depth and angle to evade each charge. The air was thick with fear, yet controlled. Every man understood that survival depended on maintaining composure while navigating an unseen gauntlet. The Japanese attempted a pincer maneuver. 2 destroyers moved to encircle the submarine, sweeping in a pattern designed to trap it. Dealey anticipated the tactic. He silently calculated the approach vector, ordered a slight rise to periscope depth, and waited for the perfect moment. At 16:42, the opportunity came. The lead destroyer, confident in its hunt, crossed the Harder's predicted path. Dealey fired 3 torpedoes in rapid succession. Seconds later, the vessel erupted in flames, the bow rising impossibly from the water before plunging into the sea. The second destroyer, caught in the same pattern, followed shortly after. Above, Japanese radio operators scrambled to make sense of the destruction. Panic replaced disbelief. Orders were issued, only to be countermanded as commanders realized their formations had collapsed. Coordination vanished. Escort crews were exhausted and demoralized. Every move they made played into Dealey's hands. The submarine surfaced briefly under the cover of dusk, its silhouette barely cut against the fading light. Deck guns were manned, scanning for any survivors or small craft attempting to flee. Yet, no immediate threats appeared. Dealey's strategy was to remain unpredictable, to strike, vanish, and reappear at a new angle. For the next 3 hours, the engagement became a deadly dance. Depth charges rocked the Harder, hurling tools and charts across compartments. Men gritted their teeth, bracing against the violent shudders, knowing that a single hull breach could be fatal. Torpedo reloads were executed with surgical precision, each round aimed at targets carefully tracked through periscope or sonar. The final strikes of the day were devastating. 2 remaining Japanese transports attempted evasive maneuvers, zigzagging desperately, but Dealey anticipated their course. At 19:05, the Harder fired her last torpedoes, sinking 1 transport and leaving the other heavily damaged. Fires leapt from the deck and black smoke rolled across the horizon. By nightfall, the convoy was effectively destroyed. 5 destroyers and a transport had been annihilated. Remaining vessels limped away, confused and battered. Japanese command could no longer deny the scale of the catastrophe. Reports that reached WWII spoke of a single submarine operating with audacity and precision unimaginable. Admirals refused to believe the evidence, insisting it must have been multiple submarines. Yet the Harder had operated alone. Every calculation, every maneuver, every torpedo fired had been the work of one captain and his crew, threading a needle of survival and destruction in waters heavily patrolled by the enemy. Dealey ordered the submarine to withdraw slowly, staying submerged until the night was fully dark. The crew moved silently, exhausted but alert. They had survived the unthinkable. Above, distant depth charges occasionally detonated as Japanese destroyers conducted searches, but none penetrated the Harder's careful evasions. In the aftermath of the attacks, the psychological effect was as significant as the physical destruction. Japanese officers were paralyzed with disbelief, unsure how to respond to a threat that had violated every assumption of naval strategy. Communications between surviving escorts were frantic and confused. Intelligence reports misidentified the attacks as multiple submarines or minefields, further delaying an organized response. For the men of the Harder, there was no triumph, only vigilance. Every man knew that the mission was not yet complete, and that the dangers of WWII were far from over. Yet in that moment, they had proven the extraordinary capabilities of a single submarine under a brilliant commander. The night closed over the Sulu Sea, concealing a hunter and his exhausted prey. The legend of the Harder was already taking shape, though the Japanese high command would only come to fully realize the implications when the patrol report reached Tokyo. By then, it would be too late.